If you could unfold a map of the Caribbean Sea in the year 1715, you'd be staring at the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. From the eastern coast of Mexico, curving down past Cuba, Hispaniola, and Jamaica, all the way to the scattered islands of the Lesser Antilles, this was a highway paved in gold, blood, and gunpowder. Spanish galleons loaded with silver from the mines of Peru. British merchant ships hauling sugar and tobacco from plantation colonies. French traders running rum and spices through narrow island channels where a single well-placed cannon could end a voyage in minutes. Now zoom in. There's Port Royal, Jamaica, sitting at the mouth of Kingston Harbor like a dare. There's Nassau in the Bahamas, a lawless republic of deserters and thieves. There's Tortuga, a fortress of vice pressed against the northern coast of Hispaniola. And threading between all of them, hundreds of pirate vessels flying black flags with skulls and crossbones, each one crewed by men who had decided that a short life of freedom was better than a long life of following orders. This was the Golden Age of Piracy. And when Disney turned it into a billion-dollar movie franchise, they got more right than you'd expect. But they also invented things so outrageous that actual historians had to write entire papers debunking them. So what did Pirates of the Caribbean nail? And what did they pull completely out of thin air? Let's start with the most obvious question. Was Captain Jack Sparrow based on a real person? Johnny Depp famously said he modeled Jack Sparrow after Keith Richards, the Rolling Stones guitarist. And that part is absolutely true. The stumbling walk, the slurred speech, the eyeliner, that's all Keith Richards. But the character himself, the lovable rogue who outsmarts everyone through a combination of luck and cunning, has roots in real pirate history that go much deeper than a rock star impression. The closest real-world parallel to Jack Sparrow is a pirate named John Calico Jack Rackham. Rackham earned his nickname from the brightly colored calico clothing he wore, which already puts him in Sparrow territory. He wasn't the most feared pirate on the water. He wasn't even close. But he was flashy, charismatic, and had a reputation for talking his way out of situations that should have killed him. He captained a relatively small crew and relied more on cunning than firepower. There's another candidate too. Henry Every, sometimes called the Pirate King, pulled off what many consider the most profitable pirate raid in history when he captured the Mughal ship Ganges Sawai in 1695. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. The haul was worth somewhere between 200,000 and 600,000 British pounds, which in today's money translates to tens of millions. After the raid, Every vanished completely. The British government launched one of the largest manhunts of the era, and they never found him. He just disappeared. Sound familiar? A pirate who pulls off impossible heists and then vanishes into legend? That's Jack Sparrow's entire arc across 5 films. But here's what the movies got wrong about Sparrow specifically. No single pirate operated the way Jack does, sailing alone or with a tiny crew, hopping from adventure to adventure like a Caribbean tourist. Real pirates operated as organized enterprises. They had articles of agreement, elected their captains, voted on major decisions, and split loot according to predetermined shares. Jack Sparrow's lone wolf routine is pure Hollywood. Now let's talk about Captain Barbossa, because Geoffrey Rush's character actually borrows from one of the most terrifying pirates who ever lived. Hector Barbossa shares characteristics with Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart. Roberts was arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, capturing over 400 ships during his career. He was known for his flamboyant style, wearing rich crimson clothing and a diamond-studded cross around his neck. He was also ruthless, strategic, and commanded enormous respect from his crew. The mutiny angle in the first film, where Barbossa takes the Black Pearl from Sparrow, mirrors real pirate politics perfectly. Captains were deposed through mutiny all the time. It wasn't personal, it was business. Roberts also had a strict code of conduct aboard his ships, which brings us to something the movies absolutely nailed: the Pirate Code. In Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, Barbossa famously says the code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules. That line is played for comedy, but it's historically accurate in a way that most viewers don't realize. Real pirate ships operated under written articles that every crew member had to agree to before joining. These weren't casual suggestions. They were binding contracts. Bartholomew Roberts had one of the most detailed sets of articles ever recorded, and some of the rules sound like they came straight out of a movie script. Every man had a vote in affairs of the moment. Every man had equal title to fresh provisions or strong liquors. The lights and candles had to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any man wanted to drink after that hour, he had to do it on the open deck. No person was to play cards or dice for money. If any man robbed another, he would have his nose and ears split. Deserting the ship in battle was punishable by death or marooning. The movies captured the spirit of this perfectly. The idea that pirates had their own form of governance, their own rules, their own twisted sense of honor. Where the film stretched the truth is in treating the code as something universal, as if all pirates everywhere followed the same set of guidelines. In reality, every ship had its own articles, and they varied wildly. Some crews were relatively democratic. Others were run by captains who ruled through fear and violence. But the core concept, a pirate code that governed behavior on the ship, that's 100% real. Now let's talk about a location that the movies recreated with surprising accuracy: Port Royal. In the first film, Port Royal is depicted as a bustling British colonial port, complete with a fort, a governor's mansion, gallows for hanging pirates, and a busy harbor filled with naval vessels. The real Port Royal was all of that and more. In the late 1600s, Port Royal was one of the wealthiest and most important ports in the New World. It sat at the tip of a long sand spit extending into Kingston Harbor, Jamaica, and it was the commercial hub of the entire Caribbean. But Port Royal had a reputation that went far beyond commerce. It was called the wickedest city on earth. At its peak, the city had one drinking establishment for every 10 residents. Pirates, privateers, merchants, and prostitutes all mingled freely. Henry Morgan, the famous privateer who later became Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, used Port Royal as his base of operations for raids against Spanish colonies. The movies show Port Royal as a relatively civilized place under British control, which is accurate for the period they're depicting, roughly the early 1700s. By that point, the British had cracked down on piracy, and Port Royal had transitioned from a pirate haven to a naval stronghold. But the films leave out the most dramatic part of Port Royal's real history. On the 7th of June, 1692, a massive earthquake struck the city. 3 separate shocks hit within minutes of each other, and the sandy ground beneath Port Royal began to liquefy. Buildings didn't just collapse, they sank. Entire streets dropped into the earth as the sand turned to liquid beneath them. Witnesses described people being swallowed alive by the ground, trapped up to their necks in sand that hardened again around them. 2/3 of Port Royal slid into Kingston Harbor. Over 2,000 people died instantly, crushed by collapsing buildings or drowned as the sea rushed in to fill the void. Another 3,000 died from injuries, disease, and the chaos that followed in the weeks after. The city never fully recovered. The British rebuilt a smaller version of Port Royal, but it was hit by hurricanes, fires, and another earthquake over the following century. Today, the ruins of the original city lie underwater in Kingston Harbor, preserved like a Caribbean Pompeii. Divers have recovered thousands of artifacts from the submerged streets, including buildings with their walls still standing, tavern signs, cooking pots, and even a pocket watch frozen at the moment the earthquake struck. 11:43 inches the morning. The movies never mention any of this, which is honestly a missed opportunity. An underwater ghost city with a pocket watch frozen at the moment of destruction would have fit perfectly into the franchise's supernatural themes. Speaking of supernatural themes, let's address the giant skeleton in the room. Cursed Aztec gold, Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman, the Kraken, Calypso, the sea goddess, undead pirate crews walking the ocean floor. These are the elements that make Pirates of the Caribbean a fantasy franchise, and none of them have any basis in historical piracy. But some of them are rooted in real maritime mythology. The legend of Davy Jones is genuinely old. Sailors have been referring to Davy Jones' locker as the bottom of the sea since at least the 1700s. The earliest known printed reference comes from 1,726 inches, a book called The 4 Years' Voyages of Captain George Roberts. Nobody knows exactly who the original Davy Jones was supposed to be. Some historians think it's a corruption of Duffy Jonah, a term for evil spirits at sea. Others think it might refer to a real pub owner named Jones, who would drug sailors and press them into service. The point is, the name Davy Jones and the idea of a supernatural figure ruling the deep ocean predates the movies by centuries. Disney didn't invent him. They just gave him tentacles. The Flying Dutchman is even older. The legend of a ghost ship doomed to sail the oceans forever originated in the 17th century, and there are dozens of reported sightings from sailors over the following 300 years. The most famous account comes from 1881, when the future King George V of England reportedly saw the Flying Dutchman while sailing off the coast of Australia. In the real legend, the ship is cursed because its captain refused to retreat during a storm, swearing he would round the Cape of Good Hope even if it took him until Judgment Day. God took him at his word. The movies borrowed the name and the concept of a cursed ship with an undead captain, but they completely reinvented the mythology. In the films, the Dutchman's job is to ferry souls of the dead to the afterlife, which is a Disney edition. The original legend is much simpler and darker. A ship that sails forever. A crew that never reaches port. The horror comes from the endless voyage itself, not from any grand cosmic duty. The Kraken, on the other hand, comes from Scandinavian mythology, not Caribbean. Norse sailors told stories about a massive sea creature capable of dragging entire ships to the bottom of the ocean. The Kraken was traditionally associated with the waters off Norway and Iceland, thousands of miles from the Caribbean. Putting a Kraken in Caribbean waters was a geographical impossibility even by mythological standards. But it looked incredible on screen, so historical accuracy wasn't exactly the priority. Now, let's get into some of the pirate practices that the movies depict. Walking the plank, marooning, buried treasure. Which ones were real? Walking the plank is probably the most famous pirate punishment in popular culture, and the movies lean into it heavily. But here's the problem. There are almost no verified historical accounts of pirates actually making people walk the plank. The idea was popularized by 19th century fiction, particularly by writers like Robert Louis Stevenson and J.M. Barrie. Most pirates who wanted to kill captives had much simpler methods: throwing someone overboard, cutting their throat, shooting them. Walking the plank, with its theatrical setup of a board extended over the water and a blindfolded victim shuffling to the edge, was a dramatic invention. Pirates weren't in the business of staging elaborate executions. They were in the business of being efficient. That said, there are a handful of documented cases from the 19th century where pirates or mutineers forced captives off a plank, so it wasn't entirely fictional. It just wasn't common, and it definitely wasn't a standard pirate practice the way the movies suggest. Marooning, however, was absolutely real. The movies depict Jack Sparrow being marooned on a tiny island with nothing but a pistol and a single shot. This is historically accurate down to the details. Marooning was one of the most feared punishments in pirate society. A marooned man would be left on a small island or sandbar, usually with a pistol, a bottle of water, and sometimes a knife. The pistol wasn't for self-defense. It was so the man could choose to end his own life rather than die slowly of thirst or starvation. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the Pirate Code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts specifically list marooning as the punishment for desertion in battle. Edward England, another famous pirate captain, was himself marooned by his own crew after they decided he was too merciful to captured sailors. England managed to build a raft and escape to Madagascar, but most marooned men weren't that lucky. The scene in the first Pirates film where Sparrow reveals that the island he was marooned on happened to be a rum runner's cache is fictional, obviously. But the practice itself, the cruelty of it, the psychological horror of being abandoned on a sliver of sand in the middle of the ocean, that's real. The movies captured the feeling perfectly. Buried treasure is another story entirely. The idea that pirates buried their loot on remote islands is one of the most persistent myths in popular culture, and it's almost entirely fiction. Only one pirate in recorded history is confirmed to have buried treasure. Captain William Kidd buried a small portion of his loot on Gardiner's Island near Long Island, New York in 1699. He did it as a bargaining chip, hoping to use the location as leverage during his trial. It didn't work. He was hanged anyway, and the treasure was recovered by authorities. Every other instance of buried pirate treasure is either legend, hoax, or invention. Oak Island, the famous money pit in Nova Scotia that has consumed treasure hunters for over 200 years? No verified connection to pirates. The supposed treasure of Blackbeard? Never found because it almost certainly never existed in buried form. Pirates spent their money. They blew it on alcohol, gambling, and women in port towns across the Caribbean. They didn't bury it on islands with elaborate maps and cryptic clues. That's Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, not historical fact. The movies play into the buried treasure myth constantly, and it makes for great cinema. But it's fiction built on fiction. Let's talk about Blackbeard, since he shows up in the fourth film, On Stranger Tides. Ian McShane plays Blackbeard as a supernatural figure with the power to control ships through voodoo magic. His ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, has flamethrowers built into the bow. The real Blackbeard was theatrical enough on his own, without any of that. Edward Teach, or Thatch, the man we know as Blackbeard, was a master of psychological warfare. Before boarding a ship, he would weave slow-burning fuses into his enormous black beard and light them so that his face was wreathed in smoke. He carried multiple pistols strapped across his chest. He cultivated a reputation as a demon from hell, and it worked. Most ships surrendered without a fight when they saw Blackbeard approaching. But here's what's interesting. Despite his terrifying reputation, there's no verified record of Blackbeard ever killing a captive. He used fear as a weapon, and it was so effective that he rarely needed to follow through on the implicit threat. The movies portray Blackbeard as a villain who uses dark magic, but the real Blackbeard's power was entirely psychological. He was a performer. He understood that reputation was worth more than violence. In a way, the real Blackbeard was more like Jack Sparrow than the movie version of himself. The Queen Anne's Revenge, by the way, was a real ship. Blackbeard captured a French slave ship called La Concorde in 1717, outfitted it with 40 cannons, and renamed it. For about a year, the Queen Anne's Revenge was one of the most feared vessels in the Atlantic. Then Blackbeard intentionally ran it aground in Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, in what many historians believe was a deliberate move to downsize his crew and keep more treasure for himself. The wreck was discovered off the coast of North Carolina in 1996, and artifacts have been recovered for decades since. Cannons, anchors, thousands of lead shot, medical instruments, and even the ship's bell have been pulled from the ocean floor. No flamethrowers were among them. Blackbeard's death, by the way, was as dramatic as anything in the movies. On the 22nd of November 1718, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy cornered Blackbeard at Ocracoke Island. During the battle, Blackbeard reportedly took 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts before finally going down. Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his ship as proof of the kill. According to legend, when Blackbeard's headless body was thrown overboard, it swam 3 times around the ship before sinking. That's almost certainly myth, but the fact that the story circulated tells you everything about how people perceived Blackbeard. Even in death, he was larger than life. Disney could have used this. Instead, they gave him voodoo powers. The real story was more cinematic than the fictional one. Now let's talk about the East India Trading Company, because this is where the movies get something fundamentally right that most viewers probably overlook. In the films, the East India Trading Company, led by Cutler Beckett, is portrayed as a ruthless corporate entity that uses the British Navy to crush piracy while simultaneously pursuing its own profit-driven agenda. Lord Beckett isn't interested in justice or law and order. He wants to control trade routes and eliminate anyone who threatens his monopoly. Pirates are just obstacles to commerce. This is remarkably close to how the real East India Company operated. The British East India Company was one of the most powerful corporations in human history. At its peak, it controlled half of the world's trade, maintained its own private army, and effectively governed large portions of India. It wasn't just a company. It was a state within a state, with the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, and execute criminals. The East India Company's interest in eliminating piracy had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with profit. Pirates disrupted trade routes, raised insurance costs, and threatened the steady flow of goods that made shareholders wealthy. The company lobbied the British government to deploy naval resources against piracy, and when the Navy succeeded, the company reaped the benefits. The movies compressed the timeline and simplified the politics. But the fundamental dynamic, a corporation using military force to protect commercial interests, is historically accurate. It's actually one of the most sophisticated elements of the franchise, hiding a genuine critique of colonial capitalism inside a popcorn adventure movie. One more real-world element the movies handle well: the transition from piracy to privateering and back again. Captain Barbossa, receiving a letter of marque from the British government in the films, reflects a real and common practice. Letters of marque were official documents that authorized private citizens to attack enemy ships during wartime. A privateer with a letter of marque was essentially a legal pirate, sanctioned by a government to raid and plunder, as long as they targeted the right ships and gave the crown its share. The line between pirate and privateer was razor thin, and men crossed it constantly. Henry Morgan raided Spanish colonies throughout the Caribbean as a privateer for England. When the political winds shifted and England made peace with Spain, Morgan was briefly arrested. Then the winds shifted again, and Morgan was knighted and made lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Francis Drake, the most famous privateer in history, was simultaneously a hero in England and a pirate in Spain. It depended entirely on whose flag you were flying. The movies capture this moral ambiguity perfectly. Barbossa works for the pirates, then for the British, then for himself. Jack Sparrow is technically a pirate, but sometimes serves the crown's interests. Will Turner starts as a blacksmith, becomes a pirate, and ends up the captain of a supernatural vessel. The fluidity of loyalty and identity in the films mirrors the real Golden Age, where allegiances shifted with every treaty, every war, and every change in the price of sugar. But there's one area where the movies go completely off the rails, and it's worth addressing because it shapes how an entire generation thinks about piracy today. The movies present pirates as rebels, free spirits fighting against oppressive empires. Jack Sparrow talks about freedom and the open sea like a philosopher. The pirate lifestyle is romanticized as an alternative to the rigid class structures of colonial society. And there's a grain of truth in that. Many pirates were former sailors who had been abused, underpaid, and brutalized by the Royal Navy or merchant captains. They turned to piracy not because they were born criminals, but because the alternatives were worse. On a pirate ship, you had a vote. You had a share of the profits. You could elect and depose your captain. In an era when most of the world lived under monarchies and rigid class hierarchies, a pirate ship was arguably one of the most democratic institutions on the planet. But the movies conveniently leave out the other side. Pirates were also slave traders. Blackbeard captured the slave ship La Concorde and took the enslaved people aboard as part of his plunder. Some pirate crews included formerly enslaved men who had been freed, yes, and that's often cited as evidence of pirate egalitarianism. But many pirates also sold captured people into slavery without hesitation. The economics of piracy were tangled up with the economics of the Atlantic slave trade in ways that the movies never acknowledge. Pirates also committed rape, torture, and murder on a scale that the PG-13 rating will never allow Disney to depict. When Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston in 1718, he held the entire city hostage for days, threatening to send the heads of his captives to the governor if his demands weren't met. When Calico Jack Rackham was finally captured, the accounts of his crew's violence against merchant sailors were graphic enough to ensure he was hanged with minimal deliberation. The movies turned piracy into an adventure. In reality, piracy was a violent criminal enterprise that terrorized communities across the Caribbean for decades. The real pirates would have been baffled by their romanticization. They weren't freedom fighters. They were men, and occasionally women, making a living through armed robbery on the high seas. Some of them did it because they had no better options. Others did it because they enjoyed it. Speaking of women, the movies feature several prominent female characters, but they missed one of the most fascinating true stories in pirate history. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed with Calico Jack Rackham and were two of the most notorious pirates of the Golden Age. When Rackham's ship was captured in 1720, Bonny and Read were reportedly the only crew members who fought back. The rest of the crew, including Rackham himself, were too drunk to defend the ship. At their trial, both women pleaded their bellies, claiming pregnancy to avoid execution. Read died in prison, likely from complications related to childbirth or fever. Bonny's fate is unknown. She simply disappears from the historical record, which is somehow more dramatic than anything the movies could have invented. The films include Elizabeth Swann as a woman who rises to become a pirate captain, and while she's fictional, the existence of real female pirates like Bonny and Read suggests that the concept isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. The movies could have gone further with this. The real stories are more compelling than the invented ones. There's one more thing worth mentioning, because it reveals how the movies shaped modern perceptions of piracy more than any history book ever could. Before Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, came out in 2003, the pirate genre was considered dead in Hollywood. The last major pirate film, Cutthroat Island, in 1995, was one of the biggest box office disasters in movie history. Studios believed audiences had no interest in pirate stories. Then Johnny Depp stumbled onto screen with his Keith Richards impression. Jeffrey Rush chewed scenery as Barbossa, and the franchise went on to earn over $4.5 billion worldwide. Pirates of the Caribbean didn't just revive the pirate genre, it defined it. When someone today pictures a pirate, they picture Captain Jack Sparrow. Not Blackbeard, not Henry Morgan, not Bartholomew Roberts. A fictional character based on a rock star has become the default image of piracy in the popular imagination. And that's both the power and the problem with what Disney created. The movies are brilliant entertainment. They capture the romance, the adventure, the moral ambiguity, and the sheer chaos of the Golden Age. They get the feel of piracy right, even when they get the facts wrong. The pirate code, the letters of marque, the corruption of colonial governments, the thin line between hero and criminal, those are all real elements woven into a fantasy narrative. But they also flatten a complicated, brutal, morally gray period of history into a theme park ride. Which, to be fair, is exactly where the franchise started. The original Pirates of the Caribbean was an animatronic boat ride at Disneyland, designed by Walt Disney himself in the 1960s. The fact that a theme park attraction became a multi-billion-dollar film franchise that shaped how an entire generation understands piracy is, in its own way, as improbable as any pirate legend. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted roughly from 1650 to 1730. In those 80 years, a few thousand men and women created a mythology that has endured for 3 centuries. Disney took that mythology, added sea monsters and cursed gold, and sold it back to the world for $4.5 billion. The real pirates would have admired the hustle. After all, taking something valuable and making a fortune from it was kind of their whole thing.